They were one of the most decorated Army infantry regiments in all of World War I. The majority of the battles they fought were deep into enemy territory, and oftentimes they were on the front lines. And when these men returned home after the war, they were given a short lived military parade before being stripped of all their accomplishments in the war, only to be forgotten in history. This is the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, dubbed the Harlem Hellfighters, the United States' first all black regiment in the First World War. Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, 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 and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I'm your host, as always, Jonathan Zen. And before I begin, I just want to thank you all so much for your support. And if you are enjoying this, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe for more. And also, I am a little bit sick right now, so if you're hearing a slightly kind of nasally voice, that's kind of what it is. If you must know, I am getting a little better now, so hopefully I should be good, probably by tomorrow. But anyways, so today, the day I'm recording this, it's Veterans Day in the US, and if you're in Europe or abroad, it's known to you as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day, respectively. But since I'm American, I'll be referring to it as Veterans Day. And while you're listening to this, it'll be a few days past Veterans Day when this episode gets uploaded. But I hope you all had a terrific Veterans Day, especially if you are a veteran of the armed forces wherever you are in the world. And kind of like the past two episodes I did, I wanted to celebrate this holiday with something related to that holiday. And what better way to talk about Veterans Day than to talk about World War One? Its end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918 is why we celebrate Veterans Day in the first place. And I'm sure wherever you are in the world, you've probably heard a lot about World War One in your history classes. So I'm not going to talk about the entire history of the war. I don't want to bore you with all that, especially if you've already taken a class that taught world history or European history for that matter. And this isn't a history podcast, and I'm nowhere near as well versed in the history of the Great War as many other historians are. Instead, I want to take today and talk to you about a group of veterans and their amazing story. As I've casually spoiled in the intro, I'm of course going to be talking about the Harlem Hellfighters, or the 369th Infantry Regiment. I'm guessing you're probably wondering, why talk about them? Why them over, the tens of thousands of other military regiments? I don't have a simple answer to that question. One of the main motivations for this is I felt a little bit ashamed as an American of how much we praise and honor the men and women of the armed forces in our country. Yet these brave men, after coming home from the war, were sort of dismissed and mistreated because of their race. And this story about the Harlem Hellfighters is not really talked about in any of the American history books, and I felt like this is a story worth mentioning because it really paints a picture of the American dichotomy between honor and respect for its military, as well as the country's deep roots in racism, which still persist and applies today. And I know this is a really complex issue that I'm nowhere near qualified to talk about. So I'm just going to be sticking to what I do know, which is the story. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the story. The 369th Infantry Regiment was formed on June 2nd, 1913, in the New York Army National Guard as the 15th New York Infantry Regiment. And for those of you who live outside of the US, or if you're an American that maybe skipped history class, the National Guard is a branch of the US Armed Forces which is composed of reserved servicemen and women. And as a member of the National Guard, he or she is under the jurisdiction of both the state that they reside in as well as the federal government. That's why you have two names for the regiment. The 369th Infantry Regiment is what it's called under the federal level, and the 15th New York Infantry Regiment is what it's called under New York State. The 369th Infantry Regiment is significant because it was the first regiment in American history to be composed entirely of people of color. And I know I mentioned earlier that I said that this was an all-black regiment, which is not entirely true because there were several Puerto Rican Americans that also served in this regiment. And another thing I want to clarify is that the US military, up until Harry Truman enacted Executive Order 9981 in 1948, was segregated by race. And while there were black regiments during the American Civil War, the 369th Infantry is different because they're also commanded by black officers as opposed to white officers during the Civil War. But anyways, in 1917, the Great War, as it was known in Europe at that time, had been going on for nearly 3 years, and during that entire time, the U.S. remained neutral, or at least tried to stay out of the war. I know you can't see me right now, but I just said neutral with air quotes because, of course, we know that even though the U.S. was technically neutral, it was still sort of indirectly involved with the war by supplying the Allied powers with weapons and other aid. So the US didn't officially join the war until April 1917. And shortly after the US officially entered into the war, the 369th Infantry was called into federal service. And on July 25th that same year, they were called to Camp Whitman in New York, where they learned their basic military training. So a few months later, on October 8th, 1917, the 369th Regiment relocated to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina for combat training. And as you can imagine, South Carolina isn't New York, and the people living there, they were much more openly racist towards the soldiers. And in one incident, Lieutenant Jim Europe and his friend Noble Sissel were trying to buy a newspaper from a local shop in Spartanburg, but the owner refused to sell to them. Several soldiers from the white 27th New York National Guard Regiment, they came to the aid of their fellow soldiers and told the shop owner that, quote, "They're our buddies and we won't buy from men who treat them unfairly," end quote. And on December 1st, the 369th, they were assigned to the 185th Infantry Brigade under Colonel William Hayward. And then they were shipped from New York Harbor on December 27th to France. And this is where sort of the real story begins. From here on out, I will call them the Hellfighters just because 369th is a little cumbersome to say, and Hellfighters just sounds really awesome. So when the Hellfighters got to France, a lot of the white officers and soldiers did not want to go into combat with black soldiers. And the solution to this was to put them to work on non-combat related duties such as loading and unloading supplies, cooking, cleaning, and all the sort of boring day-to-day things that needed to be done. There was also another reason for why they didn't want black soldiers to be fighting. And this is sort of in the realm of a more racist sort of ideology that, black people were not as smart as white people, and the level of courage and everything wasn't up to par with a white person, which of course is not true. But that's the sort of thinking that kind of persisted in American society around pretty much 100 years ago. And this sort of non-combat related role for the Hellfighters continued for about 4 months until April 8th, 1918, when the US Army assigns the Hellfighters to the French Army. So this is a major slap in the face to all of the men in the 369th Regiment. So just imagine, you sign up to join the army, you get through basic training, and during your training, you're facing racism from locals, and you get through that, and you travel to the other side of the world, only to be moving boxes of ammunition for 4 months straight. And during those 4 months, you see your fellow American soldiers getting killed or injured, but you can't do anything about it because of racism. You really want to go out there and fight. Your officers, your white officers, just won't let you. There's just sort of this feeling of not being able to do anything because racism was more of an issue to the army commanders than to send a healthy regiment of men to the battlefield. And again, these men in the Hellfighters, they wanted to prove to themselves and to the American people back home that they could fight as well as any white soldier and that they were no different from them. And then instead of fighting for and with your fellow Americans, the army decides that they don't want to deal with you, so they ship you off to the French army instead. And I just can't imagine how betrayed these guys must have felt when they found out that they were being assigned to the French army. And of course, as a final parting gift to the Hellfighters from the US Army is another slap in the face because the US Army, they ordered the entire regiment to give back their Springfield rifles along with every bit of American gear they had on. So this included helmets, uniforms, food rations, and other things. So what the U.S. Army basically said is that we don't want you here, and if you want to fight, you can fight with the French, but before you go, we want our American stuff back. I mean, you could just imagine how these guys must have felt. So after the soldiers were stripped of their American gear, they were given French weapons and gear. And the French, well, they welcomed the Hellfighters with open arms because, they've been in the war for so long, for about over 3 years now, and they were desperate for reinforcements. Um, the French army, they didn't really have the same problem with racism in terms of white soldiers fighting along black soldiers, since the French army also had a lot of soldiers from its colonies in Africa and around the world come fight for them. And this is not to say that racism wasn't present in France, it's just different from what it is in the States. And there were French officers who initially doubted the whether or not the black American soldiers had enough courage to go into battle. And these doubts were quickly laid to rest as the Hellfighters shocked the French people and the French military that they were not only willing to go into battle, but also how courageous and good they were in battle. So the Hellfighters were sent to Outpost 20 on the western edge of the Argonne Forest, which is northeast of France and borders Belgium and Luxembourg. And on the night of May 14th, two soldiers, Private Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, were posted on sentry duty during the graveyard shift between midnight and 4 p.m. And not long after the two men were on duty, German snipers began firing at them. And after the firing had stopped, Johnson and Roberts lined up a box of grenades in their trench and prepared themselves for a German raid. And just after about 2 a.m., Johnson hears a faint ticking sound. He quickly realized that the ticking sound was the sound of wire cutters cutting down the barbed wire from just across the trench. So, after hearing this, Johnson tells Roberts to run back to camp to inform the French troops about the incoming raid. Johnson then begins throwing grenades towards the direction of where he heard the clipping noises. The Germans, they quickly retaliated and began throwing grenades of their own back at Johnson. Roberts, he sees his friend getting bombarded with German grenades, so he turns around and decides to be there for his friend instead of opting to run for help. Unfortunately, as Roberts is going back to Johnson, he gets hit by a grenade and badly wounds his arm. Johnson then carries Roberts back into the trench, and the two began fighting back against the German advance by throwing the rest of the grenades they had in the box. Roberts, who couldn't throw because of his injury, handed grenades to Johnson, and he threw them at the Germans. After they ran out of grenades, the Germans quickly closed in on the both of them from all directions. Johnson was shot at in every direction, and he took bullets to the head and lip, but he was still able to manage to fire his rifle blindly into the dark. He took a few more bullets to the side and left of his hand, but he continued firing his rifle until he tried to reload an American magazine into his French rifle, which caused the gun to jam. By this time, Germans were practically on top of him, but this didn't stop Johnson from fighting. He began swinging his jammed rifle like a club until the butt of the rifle broke and he was hit on the head and fell to the ground by a German. So while he's knocked onto the ground, he sees that the German soldiers were trying to take Roberts as prisoner. So Johnson, with all of his strength, took out the only weapon he had left, which was a bolo knife. And for those of you who don't know, a bolo knife is similar to a machete, and it has its origins from the Philippines. So Johnson, he takes out his knife and charges at the Germans who were trying to take Roberts prisoner. So he begins hacking and slashing at the German soldiers, killing an officer before taking another pistol shot to his arm. And by this time, the French and Americans, they've heard all of the grenade blasts and gunfire, and they were advancing closer to their positions. The German soldiers, they noticed that reinforcements were coming, so they decided to retreat. And when reinforcements arrived, Johnson had dragged Roberts out of the trench, and he had passed out on the ground. So Johnson was taken into a field hospital where it was discovered that he had been inflicted with more than 21 wounds. And not only that, when morning came, the Allies had learned that Johnson had killed 4 German soldiers and had wounded an estimated 10 to 20 more, and had prevented the Germans from breaking through the French line. And for their efforts, the entire French force in Champagne lined up to congratulate Roberts and Johnson, as both of them received the Croix de Guerre, or the Cross of War, which is France's highest military honor. They were the first American privates to receive the medal from France, and Johnson's medal also included the highly coveted Golden Palm for extraordinary valor. The Germans, they gave Johnson the nickname Black Death after he single-handedly defended both the French line and his friend's life against a platoon of German soldiers. So shortly after this, the Hellfighters participated in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, which was the last major battle of the First World War. They were sent to the front lines on the French side and captured Seychelles, an important village in northern France. At one point, the Hellfighters were advancing so quickly that they were at risk of being cut off from the rest of the French army. And by mid October, the Hellfighters had advanced to the Vosges Mountains, and a few weeks later, on November 11th, Germany agreed to an armistice with the Allied forces, admitting complete defeat. So the armistice didn't officially end the war since a treaty was never signed, it just postponed the fighting. The Hellfighters made their final advance on November 26th, and they reached the banks of the Rhine River and became the first Allied troops to reach it. 3 weeks later, the 369th Infantry Regiment was relieved of their duties from the French army and returned home to New York before demobilizing on February 28th, 1919, and returning to the National Guard. But before the Hellfighters left Europe, France awarded the entire regiment with the Croix de Guerre, and a unit citation was awarded to the entire regiment. And when they returned home, they were greeted with a military parade around Harlem in New York City. And after the military parade, reality kind of set in. So after these veterans returned home from Europe, they were regarded as heroes and they were treated with some level of respect. But American society at that time, they were not ready to embrace the same level of respect and equality that the soldiers had enjoyed while in France. Many white people were upset at the fact that black men had been treated as equals by the French and resented that equality. For the most part, a lot of the Hellfighters who had come home were coming home to much worse treatment than they were getting while they were in war. I find it a little kind of ironic how they felt more hostility in their own home country than in a war zone. So there were many accounts of white American officers during the war who told French officers to not treat black soldiers as equals because, quote, they would expect the same treatment in America, end quote. Also, despite all of the accomplishments during the war, especially with the French army, the US did not award the Hellfighters with any military honors because they saw them more as a part of the French army and military than a part of their own. This, of course, has changed with President Obama posthumously awarding Henry Johnson with the Medal of Honor. So the Hellfighters' legacy in Europe extends just past their efforts in the war. They are often also credited for bringing jazz music to Europe. In conjunction with the combat units, there was a marching band within the regiment. Our good friend Lieutenant Jim Europe, he was not only an infantry officer, but he also served as the regiment's band leader and was a jazz musician himself. So the band was noted to bring sort of instant morale to British and French soldiers who had never listened to the sort of free flowing and improv style of jazz before, and they loved it. Remember that this was in 1918 when music and media traveled very slowly around the world, and even domestically. Jazz was sort of in its infancy in the US, so not a lot of people really listened to jazz at that point. Jazz had become very popular in Europe because of the 369th Regiment Marching Band, and especially in France, where French taste in American jazz sort of persists to this day. The 369th Infantry Regiment reestablished in May of 1942 and would go on and fight in the Pacific theater of the Second World War before officially disbanding forever on February 3rd, 1946. And that is the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, also dubbed the Harlem Hellfighters. Oh yeah, I don't think I mentioned how they got their nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters. So Hellfighters was given to the regiment by Germans because of how fierce and frightening they were in battle. And Harlem was added to their nickname because they were, of course, from New York. And Harlem is a borough of New York City that traditionally consisted of mostly a black American population. I hope you enjoyed their story. I did notice that their story is gaining a lot more attention nowadays with, mentions in video games like Battlefield 1 and in different books and media. All I'm saying is that, their story would make an awesome movie, and there aren't many World War One movies, and it's literally been 100 years since the armistice. So Hollywood, get on it. You heard it here first, folks. And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your moment of Zen. Um, I hope you all had a wonderful Veterans Day, Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, wherever you are. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya.